Time for Truth, Reigniting the Promise of America by Senator Ted Cruz. Senator Cruz, how are you, sir?
Mark, I'm doing terrific. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing wonderfully. I have a lot of questions to ask you. I don't know how many we're going to get in here, but there is this kerfuffle with you and Cruz-Rove over George H.W. Bush. Can you summarize and explain what's going on there?
Well, sure. I've got, as you mentioned a second ago, my new book, A Time for Truth, which is launching tomorrow. And one of the stories I recount in the book, A Time for Truth, is a story of when I was running for Attorney General. And I was astonished and really fortunate to get the support of President George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41. I traveled up to Kennebunkport, and much to my amazement, he offered his support, gave me a check for $1,000 from George and Barbara Bush for that Attorney General campaign. And I told Heidi it was a magical day at Kennebunkport with the President. A couple days later, Cruz-Rove calls me on my cell phone, and I've known Carl a long time. And Carl begins yelling and berating and cursing at me. And it...
Wait a minute, Cruz-Rove did that? No way.
I know it's hard to believe.
Yes.
Well, it turns out that Carl told me that he was busy raising money for the George W. Bush Library in Dallas, and that a number of big Republican donors in Dallas who were writing 7 and 8 figures to the library were also backing a state rep in Dallas who was thinking of running for Attorney General as well. And he said they were furious. Why is the Bush family supporting someone who's not our guy? And I responded to Carl, look, I was just doing what you had advised. Carl had suggested that I slowly build support. And he said, well, you weren't supposed to get 41. And actually Carl added a particularly unkind comment that he said that 41 was too old to have good judgment anyway, which I was offended by, and I knew it was false from having spent the afternoon with him. He was insightful and had wisdom, and that was not an accurate characterization. Well, I asked Carl, what do you want me to do? And Carl said, return the check. I said, well, I can't do that. We've already deposited it. Under Texas law, we have to report it. He said, fine, then do nothing to draw attention. And he drew out the hammer. He said, if you do, he implied that Bush 43, George W. Bush, would endorse my opponent in the race, which was a fairly striking threat, given that I had worked for George W. Bush to help elect him in his administration for a total of 4 years. I told Carl, I'll do whatever you like. An hour later, we got approval from Bush 41 for the endorsement statement for an effusive quote endorsing me in the race for Attorney General, and I told my staff to throw it in the trash because of Carl's request. Now, I recount that in the book. And I'll tell you, Heidi, my wife, when she was sitting there during this call, she was livid. And she said, you know, this is what's wrong with the Republican Party. Why should the Attorney General race in Texas turn on who the donors are to the George W. Bush Library? She was furious. Well, when this story that's in my book, A Time for Truth, that comes out tomorrow, when it broke in the news, Carl last night put out a statement claiming all of it was a lie, none of it was true, and he claimed he wasn't raising money for the library, he wasn't doing anything for a state rep in Dallas, that it was all made up, and he claimed it was all about other topics. Now, unfortunately, everything Carl said in that statement was just inaccurate. I've known Carl a long time. I never imagined his response would be to come out with an outright falsehood. But fortunately, I had saved the emails from our correspondence, and so last night I released the emails where Carl, in writing, makes very explicit that the reason he asked me not to do anything to draw attention to 41 support is because major donors in Dallas to the George W. Bush Library were ticked off, in his own words, that the Bush family was supporting not our guy. And
all right, well, before we run out of time, so Cruz-Rove lied to you again.
Well, the statement he put out yesterday was objectively false. I was disappointed. I don't know why he did that, but that is what he chose to do.
That's absolutely remarkable. But your book is more fulsome than this. This is a very interesting piece of information. But, yeah.
You know, the book, what I really try to do is shine a light on what's happening in Washington, in the Washington cartel, what happens behind closed doors. You know, if your listeners, if you've ever wondered what happens in the Republican Senate lunches and the closed-door meetings, what leadership is doing, this book really tries to shine a light on it, on how the Washington cartel, career politicians, Republicans and Democrats, get in bed with Washington lobbyists and giant corporations and conspire to grow government to favor cronyism and corporate welfare at the expense of hardworking taxpayers. I also describe in considerable detail my time clerking at the U.S. Supreme Court and litigating before the Supreme Court, trying to give people a window to what happens at the court. And so I think it is an interesting read with a lot of anecdotes, just like the one I shared about Carl, that give an inside perspective on what's really happening.
It's called A Time for Truth, Reigniting the Promise of America. What do you think about Chris Christie jumping in tomorrow, or maybe today, whenever he's jumping in?
Oh, I like Chris Christie. I think he's bold. I think he's brash. I'm always glad to see when Republicans get elected in blue states, and so I welcome him to the race. And he has had some less than kind words to say about me, but I'm not going to respond in kind. I'm going to respond by taking the high road and welcome him to the race. I think his presence will make the eventual Republican nominee all the stronger to defeat Hillary in November 2016.
Well, he says really only should be nominated. When I look at his record, New Jersey's been downgraded 9 times. So I think, it's important to look at the records of governors and senators, don't you think?
Absolutely, and I always think it's amusing how the mainstream media treats it as newsworthy that governors say they prefer governors as candidates. Look, I think the question...
Except when it came to John McCain.
Well, and that's true.
Was he a governor?
That line, "we need a governor," only is said on television and from Washington when the moderate choice is a governor. When in 1980, when the conservative choice was a governor, Ronald Reagan, then we were told we needed a former congressman, George Herbert Walker Bush. In 1996, when the moderate choice was Bob Dole, no one said we needed a governor then. In 2008, no one said we needed a governor then when it was John McCain. Washington only says we need a governor when it's a proxy for we need a moderate, and every time we nominate an establishment moderate, we lose.
And how come it's only with Republicans? Was Hillary a governor?
Of course not. And listen, going back to the theme you and I were talking about, I think Republican primary voters are interested from every candidate in 2016. When have you stood up to the Washington cartel? It's one thing to say you opposed Democrats or Obama. That's easy to say you're doing. But when have you stood up to Republican leadership and the Washington cartel? Now, I guess some of the candidates could say, well, I stood up to Republicans to embrace amnesty. And as you know, the mainstream media will praise you as a bipartisan statesman when you stand up to Republicans from the left. But the question I think primary voters are going to ask is, when have you stood up to Republican leadership, to the corruption in Washington from the right, standing with the people and the Constitution and standing for liberty?
Ted, I could talk to you for hours about this. I can't. Best of luck with this wonderful book, A Time for Truth, Reigniting the Promise of America. Senator Ted Cruz, thank you, sir.
Thank you, my friend. God bless.
God bless.